Me and Zaya, from the day she was born, were freaking tight. Every time I walked into her house, she was so excited. Grandpa, and she'd run over to me and grab me and wouldn't let go.
Lance Corporal Bill Klobas, known to the guys in his unit as Rocket Man. If this is the first time you're hearing his voice, I suggest going back to episode 7 for part 1 of his story.
I'm sitting there watching cartoons with her. She looked at me and this big smile on her face. And all of a sudden it was like a sledgehammer hit me in the head.
Bill is recounting a PTSD episode from about 3 years ago. It wasn't his first. He had been dealing with PTSD and with depression since returning from Vietnam in 1969. But this time, it drove him to desperation. And that desperation drove him to the kitchen table of his daughter, Casey Byington.
There was a point in the war where the U.S. government really became about body count. They would be required to walk into a ville after it had been destroyed and count body parts. You know, a leg here, a torso there, grandmas and grandpas and young children, and try to piece together what that meant for body count numbers.
47 years later, Bill is watching cartoons with Zaya, his granddaughter and Casey's niece, when those images suddenly come rushing back.
And I saw her as one of the kids that I saw in Vietnam.
It was like his mind just started playing this movie reel of all these young, innocent children.
And I couldn't stop these images in my mind.
What do I do? I'm not a psychologist. I'm not a Vietnam veteran helper. I have no clue what to do with this.
But Bill sought out his daughter for a reason. She's relentless, and she would need every bit of her tenacity to get him the help he needed. In this episode, we'll conclude the story of Rocket Man with Casey's full frontal assault on the bureaucracies that stood between her father and the peace and recognition he deserves. Medical attention for his traumatic brain injury, which hadn't even been diagnosed yet. Psychological care for the PTSD brought on by memories he didn't talk about to anyone for 47 years. And connecting all of that to Bill's service in Vietnam, Casey wills these things into existence.
I call it my last hope at a normal life.
And then, just on account of principle, Casey picks a fight with the United States Marine Corps. From the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, founders of The Wall, this is Echoes of the Vietnam War. I'm your host, Michael Crone, bringing you stories of service, sacrifice, and healing from people who still feel the impact of that conflict nearly 50 years later. This is episode 8, Rocket Man, Part 2. When Bill Klobas walked out of the Marine Corps and into 1969 San Francisco, he felt set adrift.
I remember walking off the base at Treasure Island, and these guys in the duty at the guard station said, "Have a good one, man." I said, yeah.
Bill had just spent nearly 6 months hospital hopping his way home from Vietnam, where he had been hit by an artillery round in a friendly fire incident during Operation Oklahoma Hills. Guys in his unit say he was blown 30 feet through the air, and when they got to him, he was bleeding from the ears, eyes, nose, and mouth. They had him medevaced out of that valley and never saw him again. Based on his condition at the time of his dust-off and the fact that he never returned to his unit, they assumed that he died of his injuries. In fact, he had sustained a traumatic brain injury, or TBI, which would not be diagnosed or treated until decades later. In the meantime, Bill bounced around for a little bit and then fell in love and got married. Eventually, he and his wife Gail had 4 children. Bill worked steadily and raised a family with Gail, and never spoke about the things he'd experienced in Vietnam. Like so many of his comrades, he had left Vietnam, but Vietnam hadn't left him.
I was doing pretty good for quite a while. I was doing a lot of carving, a lot of artwork because I liked doing it and it kept my mind occupied. And I was doing some pretty nice stuff, and I was kind of proud of myself for what I was doing. And without being able to help it, I start thinking about the same things again. And I start feeling really guilty. And that leads to depression. So all of a sudden, I'm going from thinking everything's okay and everything's going to be great now to I'm right back again. Right back there again to the horrible shit that happened, and there's nothing I can do about it. It won't leave my mind.
Bill suffered in silence for decades. He kept it from his family, from his friends, and because he felt so mistreated by his government, he wasn't about to turn to it for help.
The first time somebody mentioned the VA to me, I told them, you know what? You can take the VA and stick it where the sun don't shine. I don't want nothing from any of those people. Government, military, nobody.
Bill's PTSD episodes recurred every few years, and he still had that undiagnosed TBI, but he just kept marching. Eventually, in the early 1990s, he and his family moved from California to Idaho. More than 20 years after his tour and his injury, he wanted medication, so he connected with a VA outpatient clinic in Pocatello, about 100 miles from where they lived.
So I had a caretaker, and he or she would see me twice a year. They would do blood tests, they would do cardiogram, they would do this and that. No one talked, though. It was strictly medication, In 93 or 94, when I had an episode, it was the same thing again, but this time it was a lot more intense. I called my caretaker in Pocatello and I said, I need to talk to somebody. Set me up with a psychiatrist. I went down and I was able to talk to her, mostly crying my eyes out because the emotion was so much when I was going through one of these things that it was unbelievable. I got to meet with her 5 times, and she prescribed me a pill called Zoloft. It's an antidepressant medication. Start taking Zoloft, and actually a couple months later, I started feeling a little better.
That sense of relief enabled Bill to continue functioning in a way that, to anyone looking in from the outside, seemed pretty normal. The Zoloft helped him keep the depression at bay, but eventually, Band-Aids work their way loose and wounds are exposed. And that's exactly what happened 3 years ago, which brings us back to Casey's kitchen table.
All I knew was that when he left the next day, I couldn't not follow up with this. I couldn't just sit with this. It was eating at me of like, he came to me, and I know that he came to me wanting something. I didn't know what at the time, but I just knew that something had to be done, and it had to be done fast. And he had called his VA primary care doctor and asked for some help, asked to talk to somebody. And she had sent him the 1-800 number, the suicide hotline number, and made him an appointment that was 3 weeks out and told him that was the earliest they could see him at the time, which just absolutely disgusted me because it was like, you're not understanding the urgency.
Still reeling from everything she had just seen and heard, and not knowing where to turn, Casey called her younger brother Brian. She told him about their father's meltdown, about the 3-week wait for an appointment, and Brian agreed they needed to do something right away.
And so he and I ended up hiring a psychologist in Idaho Falls, which was close to Dad's area. She agreed to see him the next day because we just said, this is urgent, like he needs this now. And he went to her a couple of times, but he immediately knew that it wasn't the right fit because there's something about talking to what he called a civilian psychologist that just cannot handle the war stories, So that was when I just started pressing really, really hard. And what I mean by that is, 15 phone calls a day, if that's what it took, to his primary care doctor. And I said, I want him seen now. I want him into somebody. I don't want you to tell me 3 weeks. I don't want you to tell me tomorrow. I want it today. And eventually, I guess what happened is I broke her down and she connected us with the vet centers.
Bill was enrolled in a 12-week outpatient program for veterans suffering from PTSD. In the meantime, in order to make sure that any further treatment was covered, Casey knew she would need to connect Bill's suffering to his service.
I got his C file. I started digging for anything, anywhere that I could find that would piece together this story of his service time, but also of his injury. And I was like, okay, how do I find comrades from Vietnam from 1968 that will remember serving with my father? And honestly, it started with a couple of Google searches. I Facebook searched his India Company 37, and lo and behold, they had a Facebook group. So we found him that group. We found him, Al Moreno, and Richard, I don't want to say his last name because I won't say it right, but his name is Ski. That they were the two comrades that were serving with him the day he was hurt. And so we were able to connect them, and they were able to kind of talk through some of the dots, if you will, of Dad's missing story and help piece things together for us.
Armed with newly unearthed details about that April afternoon in 1969, Casey thought that having Bill's injury service-connected would be easy. It wasn't.
One of the hardest things for my dad is having an injury that no one can see. If you have an arm blown off or a leg blown off during combat, it's obvious to the common civilian, what's wrong. But Dad's is internal and it's all in his head as far as brain injury. And so that's definitely been really difficult for him to try and explain over and over, what happened and why it's caused so much damage. If they deny that, then it's basically like them saying to him, you're not really suffering, or you're not suffering enough. And that in my mind is just, again, I'm baffled by that. Like, who gets to decide, sitting in a cubicle somewhere in Washington, D.C., that my dad's not suffering enough? So yeah, it's been a very long journey. It's been 3 years, and we're on appeal number 4 for his benefits, working with the Disabled American Veterans, the DAV, as his advocate. I'd like to say that I like a challenge, but this challenge has been exceptionally daunting. And I am ready for it to, be done and have some light at the end of the tunnel.
This process is so burdensome, a lot of people just give up after the first denial. But after 3 years, Casey and Bill are on their 4th appeal, and they're still battling. It's exhausting. So where does she get the energy to fight on a second front, this time against the United States Marine Corps? She's motivated by principle, and the principle at stake this time is the Purple Heart that her father earned but never received. While the battle for benefits is long and tedious, the fight for Bill's Purple Heart will last only 7 months, but it is brutal.
I was called a liar. I was told that the eyewitness statements that I had submitted, that were, by the way, notarized, were false, that I had made them up.
We'll take a short break, and when we come back, the Marine Corps picks a fight with the wrong woman.
I've been raised to never give up, and if I know that something is right, to stand up for what I believe in.
Here at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, we wish everybody could come and visit the wall in Washington, D.C. But we know that not everybody can get to the wall, and so we bring the wall to you. The Wall That Heals is an exact replica of the one in D.C. at 3/4 scale, and it travels to communities all across America. The Wall That Heals and the Mobile Education Center that travels with it will be in the beautiful town of Nahant, Massachusetts, July 15 through 18. For more 2021 tour dates and locations, visit vvmf.org. Our little podcast is growing up fast. Last week we passed 3,000 listens, and we're really grateful for your support. Some of you, I know, are wondering, what else can I do to help Echoes grow? Well, I have a couple of ideas. First, you can share it with a friend who might like it as well. Another thing that you can do, and it helps us out just way more than you could imagine, is if you leave us a rating or a review wherever you get your podcasts, like Apple Podcast or Spotify, for example. You'd be surprised when you do that how much it helps new listeners find us. So help us spread the word. And in the meantime, let us know what you think by emailing echoes@vvmf.org. Casey Klobas has spent the last 3 years seeing to it that her father gets the care that he needs, that he receives the benefits he has earned, and that he makes healing connections with comrades that help him realize he isn't alone. On top of all of that, she's working with her congressional delegation to rewrite the rules so that the path will be smoother for those who come after her. All of this while fulfilling the roles of devoted wife, mother, and career professional. So what's she doing in her spare time? Well, for the past 7 months, Casey has been in a pitched battle with the U.S. Marine Corps over a Purple Heart medal for her father. You might think that her argument is bulletproof and that this will be a fairly straightforward process. You would be half right.
We filed for my dad's Purple Heart in September. They denied it on March 2nd. The thing that was missing from his records in their mind was proof that he was treated by a medical officer and not just a nurse after his injury. He was treated on the USS Sanctuary, which was decommissioned in 1970, and they purged all of the records except the deck logs when that happened. So Dad's records were missing. So that's what then started us on the mission of trying to find comrades for eyewitness accounts.
Eyewitness accounts were critical to Bill and Casey's efforts, but Bill's last contact with anyone from his unit was on the day they choppered him out in April of 1969. One day, while doing some research on Operation Oklahoma Hills, Bill found a 10-minute documentary on YouTube. As he was trying to press the button for full screen mode, he accidentally hit the Show Comments button instead. There, among the comments, was one from Al Moreno, who was working on a book about his time in the Marines and wanted to talk to anybody who had been involved in the operation. He had included his phone number, so Bill called him. As it turns out, Moreno had been one of the first Marines to reach Bill after he was injured. He was an eyewitness. And not only that, but Moreno was still in contact with the radio man who called in Bill's medevac. It was Richard Cherniewski, called Ski by his buddies. By an incredible stroke of accidental luck, Casey and Bill now had the two eyewitnesses they needed. And boy, were those guys surprised to hear from Rocket Man.
They did not think there was any way that he could live after what they saw happen to him. So nobody ever knew that he actually survived that. I started calling supervisors, colonels, majors. I even talked to the Major General, Greg Olson, who is over the United States Marine Corps. And I just said, I'm not some person who applied for this lightly. I've done my homework. I've done the research. This needs to happen for my father.
Even with two eyewitness accounts in hand, Casey was still running into brick walls. The trouble was the missing records. Casey had found Bill's C file, which was complete, but that's not what the Marines were looking at.
They didn't look at my father's complete military record when they denied it on March 2nd. They looked at his National Archive record, not his C file record. And some of his doctor notes and records from 1969 were not in the file from St. Louis. And I knew that because as they were talking to me about things, they kept saying things that I was like, wait, you're not looking at the right page. You're not looking at the right page. You can't be looking at the right thing. And it wasn't until I started talking to the colonel in that office that he said to me, are you making up documents, Casey? Are you pulling these out of a shoebox in your garage? None of this is in your dad's file. They thought that I was falsifying documents to get my dad his Purple Heart. That was so, I don't know. You can say a lot of things, but when you try to demean my character, that was one of those points where I was just like, I cannot believe you just said that to me. And it wasn't until I could sit down with the general and say, I'm looking at my dad's C file. What are you looking at? And they said, the file from St. Louis, that I said, those are not the same. You don't have all of the pieces. So I had to then send them my dad's C file, which is his complete record. But again, I just stop and think, how many other veterans have been denied their award because they weren't even looking at their full file? And how many of those veterans got that no and just walked away with it because they didn't know how to reply to that? Because when they told us no and I asked to speak to a supervisor, it was not pretty. I was treated very, very poorly by that office. I was told that the eyewitness statements that I had submitted that were, by the way, notarized, were false, that I had made them up. I was told that by the supervisor before she hung up on me. I would be lying if I didn't say there were days that I just curl up into the fetal position and throw the white towel out and say, I'm done. I can't do another day of this. I can't prove to another doctor that this happened to my dad. I can't, I definitely have those moments of weakness of what is this all for? But here we are, and I feel so much closer to my dad today than I have ever felt in my life. And I have always been Daddy's little girl, his only daughter. My father has always been a hero in my eyes. You know, before I knew any of the details of his service time, I feel like, you know, this is my chance to really be in his corner and to really help him, you know, realize that asking for help was a brave thing to do. And if that can help one other veteran who's suffering in silence right now reach out and ask for help, then this was all worth it. You know, if one other veteran applies for an award in the awards branch and they look at their claim in a different light because of what we went through, then it was all worth it. Whether Dad gets his recognition or not.
It was the 4th of May when I recorded my interview with Casey, and she was expecting any day the results from the latest board review of Bill's Purple Heart appeal. 2 days later, on May 6th, I got an email from Casey with the subject line, "We did it." I opened it and it said, "Michael, I received official word today that Dad is being awarded the Purple Heart for his service. I am overwhelmed. Casey." Lance Corporal Bill Klobas received his Purple Heart in an official medal ceremony on Friday, the 18th of June.
I want to say thank you.
That's Bill Klobas of Swan Valley, finally receiving a Purple Heart on Friday. 52 years after he was hit by friendly fire in Vietnam back in 1969.
This is to certify the President of the United States of America has awarded the Purple Heart, established by General George Washington at Newburgh, New York, August 7, 1782. Presented to Lance Corporal Bill L. Klobas, United States Marine Corps, for wounds received in action on 26 April 1969 in Vietnam. Given under my hand in the city of Washington the 6th day of May 2021. Signed by the Commandant of the Marine Corps, D.H. Berger.
Too long coming for sure. More than 1.8 million service members have been presented with the Purple Heart since it was created in 1782. Now there's one more.
I don't think that if I were any one of your 3 brothers, I would mess with you.
I'll be sure to pass that along.
Big thanks to Casey for reaching out to us with Bill's story and for recording the interview with her father. And also to KTVB, Boise's Channel 7. And thank you for checking out the official podcast from the founders of the Wall in Washington, D.C. We'll see you in 2 weeks.